Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. My name is Kate Gingles, and this is
Helen.
And we both work for the Nature Trust of New Brunswick with the conservation team. And this morning we're here to talk about the forested wetlands that may be on your properties as part of our Environmental Trust Fund initiative to empower private landholders with the skills and resources needed to recognize, protect, and sustainably manage forested wetlands on private lands. And so our discussion this morning will go over a few topics in regards to forested wetlands, including what ecosystem services they can provide, and some general features and biodiversity associated with forested wetlands. We'll then move on to talking about some specific species at risk that inhabit these areas, factors that might threaten these species and this habitat, and the legislation that aims to protect them. In other presentations, we've gone over some great information about how to identify a forested wetland on your property and some of the ecosystem services provided by this unique habitat. So we wanted to go into a bit more detail for a few of them. There are many types of ecosystem services wetlands can provide, both to people and their surrounding environment. These can include water purification, carbon sequestration, and nutrient cycling. This is a result of a combination of biological, physical, and chemical processes where the unique vegetative and microbial communities within a forested wetland can break down and recycle nutrient inputs like phosphorus, nitrogen, and carbon within the system, from the soils to shrubs to trees. So because of the waterlogged soils found in wetlands, decomposition of organic matter takes more time than in grasslands or other drier forest stands, meaning the carbon that was stored in the plants is held for longer amounts of time in the soil as opposed to being released into the atmosphere. This makes forested wetlands very important carbon sinks capable of storing massive amounts of carbon. This, however, only remains true when left undisturbed, really underscoring the importance of keeping forested wetlands as intact as best as possible. Forested wetlands are also unique in that they are excellent microclimate regulators, meaning they're able to maintain relatively consistent climatic conditions in terms of humidity and temperature. As the ground vegetation layer of a forested wetland can be composed of mosses, peat, lichen, and saturated soils, moisture is held within the stand and released through evapotranspiration when temperatures heat up. Because of these plants, forested wetlands are able to absorb large amounts of water from flooding and rainfall, making them great sponges for mitigating flooding and recharging groundwater. Lastly, forested wetlands are very structurally complex systems that create habitat in many different ways. So on top of this wide range of ecological services forested wetlands can provide, they also help to foster diverse habitats that support a huge range of species and their individual life histories. So when you look at this picture, for example, you might not think much of it. At first glance, it might look like a forest with a bunch of dead and fallen over trees. But if you look closer, you'll see a few different microhabitats created under hummocks, which we have circled here, shelter and nesting opportunities in the dead trees, or otherwise called snags or hollowed logs. You would also notice some of the structurally complex area created by some uprooted trees, as would be enhanced by tree regeneration, mosses, and ground vegetation in some areas, creating the ideal habitat for ground nesting, bird species, foraging, and overwintering habitats. Standing water is created by seasonal hydrological changes. This can be caused by ice scour, snowmelt, and flooding. Also help to increase riparian connectivity within a forest, benefiting amphibians, mammals, reptiles, birds, lichens, plants, and invertebrates, while maintaining this rich saturated soil. So some of the species that call wetlands home are listed under the Species at Risk Act, otherwise known as SARA, which acts as a living document that provides the legal framework for protection of a species on federal lands based on their risk assessment. These species of interest are typically brought to the attention of the Canadian government by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, or COSEWIC, you might have heard it called, which is an independent body of experts responsible for identifying and assessing wildlife species considered to be at risk. There's also a Provincial Species at Risk Public Registry by the Department of Natural Resources and Energy Development, or NRED, where a similar committee to COSWIC, COSAR, brings forward species to be assessed by the provincial government. And lastly, watercourse and wetland alteration regulations are governed by the Clean Water Act under the Department of Environment and Local Government in New Brunswick. Any disturbances occurring within the required 30-meter buffer of the wetland or watercourse will be required to have a permit. So some of these at-risk species are likely to be found on forested wetlands on your properties, but for this presentation, we'll focus on just a few, with the first being the Canada warbler. This species is designated under COSEWIC as of special concern, while SARA has it classified as threatened. It is also protected under the Migratory Birds Convention Act, so it is protected on private lands. Its nesting habitat is on or near the ground in well-concealed areas under coarse woody debris, hummocks, which are these areas created by the space under roots of overturned trees. Their breeding season is from late May to early August, and their main threats being loss of breeding and overwintering habitat, forest fragmentation, and changes to hydrology. So the average home range for a Canada warbler is less than 1 hectare in size, and you can see kind of where their nesting habitat falls on the forest floor here. So you'll typically find them between 0 to 6 feet off the ground in areas with a very complex understory. The next species that we're going to highlight is the olive-sided flycatcher, which is listed as endangered in New Brunswick and threatened federally across Canada. Its nesting habitat is typically in large clumps of large mature conifers, and you'll find them away from the trunk. So the olive-sided flycatcher uses forested wetland edges with tall snags, so tall dead trees, so they can feed on flying insects in the open area in displays called sallying. Their breeding season is between April and June, and their primary threats include loss of breeding and overwintering habitat, insect declines due to climate change and pesticides, and snag removal. So you can see in this diagram the difference between where they nest within the canopy layer, as opposed to the Canada warbler, which nests on the ground typically. You see the olive-sided flycatcher is nesting in areas greater than 30 feet off the ground. Our last species of avian species that we're going to focus on is the rusty blackbird, which is listed as of special concern by both COSEWIC and SARA. Its nesting habitat is within shrubs or small trees over or near water. So it'll breed typically in forested peatlands and swampy wetlands, as it relies on aquatic invertebrates for its food. Its breeding season is between late April to early May, and its primary threats include wetland degradation, drainage and acidification, and contamination. So rusty blackbirds will arrive in this area of Canada in April, making them one of the earliest migratory bird species to arrive over here in New Brunswick. And so this is their typical, we don't have the same diagram for them as we do the olive-sided flycatcher in the Canada warbler, but this is the typical habitat that you might find them in with this open standing water, so they're able to see and hunt for the aquatic invertebrates. So when we're going to talk about best management practices for maintaining your forest wetland, the first and best thing for us to recommend is for you to do nothing to your woodlot, which would ultimately fulfill all of the BMPs on this list. If you are still conducting some harvesting, try to follow some of these practices to maintain the integrity of your woodlot, and these can include avoiding harvesting or road building within wetlands or altering wetland hydrology. Use uneven aged forest management systems. Retain mature trees scattered within openings or in clumps. Open canopy and enhanced understory structure is that particularly important for Canada warbler. Retaining greater than 12 live trees per hectare for singing and display centers. Leave tops and limbs to enhance coarse woody material. Protect and create patches of 0.1 to 0.2 hectares for territory cores. Retain as many snags as safely possible. And lastly, particularly our at-risk species, encourage irregular boundaries, which are those typically created by beavers in wetlands. So I'm going to pass it off to Helen, who's going to talk more about species at risk lichen.
So I'm going to talk about some species at risk that our organization works on. So they rely on forested wetlands as critical habitat. They're part of, as I kind of mentioned, an ongoing project focused on surveying for and identifying species at risk in order to acquire land as nature preserves or to conserve these areas just in partnership with landholders through our Conservation Partners program. Their establishment and continued survival depends primarily on humid pockets, so that's often in areas of open water, and undisturbed old growth forested wetlands. So this means that there's a lack of major historical disturbances like harvesting and the presence of at least some large or legacy trees. The threats to this species are deforestation, pollution, and climate change. They are indicators of ecological continuity and a microclimate stability or healthy air quality. These lichens are very sensitive to changes in humidity, forest structure, and pollution slash human disturbance. BMPs for this species, and it will be similar to all lichen, at least in the New Brunswick area, in New Brunswick. So protecting their habitats by identifying them on the ground and surveying for these species at risk lichen is the first and most crucial step. Then recommendations that we make to landholders is typically to respect a minimum buffer, which our team maps out and can provide as a resource. This can vary from observation to observation and forested wetland to forested wetland. So if an observation is made, typically it's a 100-meter buffer around that area recommended to just avoid harvesting near at least the observation or even the host species in general. And this avoids threatening the population. So the host species for wrinkle shingle, like white rim shingle lichen, is in New Brunswick, eastern white cedar mostly, and sometimes on red maple in these open swamp habitats. This is, we find them, as you can see, large, mature, or at least been around a while. Mature can be a sticky word, but this kind of stand complexity where there's a bunch of different sizes of trees, a bunch of them are leaning over, it's quite dense, which retains a lot of humidity and allows those species to establish and to not just establish, but also to continue as a population. Next one we're going to talk about, so very similar to the white rim shingle lichen species, this lichen, the blue felt lichen, depends on humidity and undisturbed forested wetlands of mature eastern white cedar. Their habitat varies because they are rarely found far from the coast and almost always restricted to upland tolerant hardwood forests and near coastal swamps. So there's kind of a salty element to their establishment and continued survival. The BMPs for this species are the same and they can vary from situation to situation, but to ultimately preserve the ecological value of a site for these species is important. It ultimately preserves the ecological value of a site that these species are indicative of. So if they indicate old growth forests and healthy air quality, they're something that we consider valuable for conservation. And intrinsically, marking no touch zones is always recommended, and at minimum avoiding harvesting of the host species where an observation is made. So the status of this species is of special concern under Kosiwick and Sarah, given that they're found in such a niche sort of habitat. Some examples of where we would find them are in very similar areas, just like I had mentioned, more coastal, are dense, mature, eastern white cedar dominated stands that have a lot of often sphagnum moss or moss in general that retains the water in the system, allowing them to establish. And they typically grow a couple meters from the ground on leaning cedars, but not always. So this kind of habitat, when we stumble upon it, you kind of check every tree you can above eye level. And yeah, next, the last lichen we're going to talk about is the wrinkle shingle lichen, which is threatened and endangered under both Cusiwik and Sarah. So this is the rarest one in the province. Its host species in New Brunswick are typically black ash and sometimes red maple, more commonly on black ash. They can often be found in the same or similar swamp habitats as white rim shingle lichen because cedar and black ash dominated areas can overlap. So often they're either co-dominant or dominant black ash or dominant eastern white cedar, but they grow together sometimes. So always keeping an eye out for both of these species when entering swampy habitat or habitat that we've modeled and assessed as potential critical habitat for these species. So the hosts, the threats are the same to this species as the previous two lichen, so deforestation, climate change, acid rain, etc. So this is where you would typically find them. This picture on the right with the small observation of wrinkle shingle is on a fallen and dead black ash, and then just a quick image of kind of the canopy, given that it just demonstrates that it's a dense forest, swamp, forested wetland, tree wetland, and so that they would typically be found in those areas. Next, the black ash. So this is also a threatened species under Cusiwik. They grow in seasonally flooded hardwood swamps and riparian ecosystems. They are important culturally significant species through basket and craft making, and they are also just an intrinsically valuable species and habitat type. So the emerald ash borer and habitat loss are important factors affecting their conservation status. Threats are insect pests, drainage, and climate change. So with these warming temperatures, it is expected that the emerald ash borer may become a greater threat in this region. On our surveys in these forested wetland areas, we always note location data and count them, get a rough count estimate of where they are because it's important. It's not something that at this current moment is really in the database for the province. And yeah, no, it just makes it's quite difficult given that this black ash is both at risk itself and is the host species for another incredibly endangered lichen species. So we often find them together, and yeah, rare on rare is not can be tough. So just to overlap again, so threats to forested wetlands, just generally, drainage, so water supply, logging and land development, climate change, invasive species like the emerald ash borer, and habitat fragmentation. So conservation and management strategies, again, like we have mentioned, it really is case by case, but for the most part, maintaining hydrology or creating buffer zones at least above 30 meters, which is just the riparian area, and is legally binding, and maintaining landscape connectivity, avoiding harvesting during sensitive periods, so nesting and breeding season, retaining snags and coarse woody debris whenever that is safe to do so and feasible for you and your goals on your woodlot, and to record baselines and be aware of changes over time. So going to these areas, getting a good idea of what's there right now so we can understand what is on there at this moment in time, and will hopefully inform management in the future. So briefly, because it was mentioned, just the WAWA permit is required for any alteration within 30 meters of a watercourse or wetland, and may be subject to an EIA if greater than 2 hectares. So just to be aware of species at risk residing on your land, and you can check their status on through Sarah or Cusiwik. It's available online, but we understand that can be difficult to identify for a lot of people. So through the Nature Trust, we have a program called the Conservation Partner Program in which we can do the identifying for you. So some other resources, not just, so there, our organization, but also the New Brunswick Federation of Woodlot Owners, the DLG, Government of New Brunswick, the Department of Environment and Local Government, Conservation Council of New Brunswick, the Nature and Bee has a really good online resource. They have an eco help hub for a lot of frequently asked questions. The Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Center is where a lot of our data goes. So the counts we take on black ash, all the observations we take of species at risk goes directly to them, so that there's a comprehensive map of where these species are, and then we can get a trend over time. And finally, Ducks Unlimited Canada. So just to quickly review, forested wetlands are hotspots for biodiversity. They are often critical habitat for several species at risk. It's important to be aware of nesting and breeding times. If you do have forested wetlands on or near your property and plan to either harvest or just be in your woodlot. Maintaining natural conditions as best as possible is often or mostly recommended on a case-by-case basis. And integrated management plans are key to long-term ecosystem sustainability. So that's where we can come in and help and plan. And the only way that things can be planned and moved forward is to get some sort of baseline and to have a relationship with the people who care about their land. So you won't have any questions because this is recorded.
But if you do have questions,
you could send them to our conservation email or at info.ntnb.org, and someone will get back to you. Or on our website, we've also got our office phone number if you want to call, and
we're happy to help.
We're happy to help. And social media, people leave comments there. So we're quick to respond.
So feel free to reach out.
Feel free to reach out.
And thank you for listening.
Thank you.